What if everything you believe about God began long before the Bible? This question might seem absurd at first glance, but what if it holds the key to one of humanity's greatest spiritual secrets? The history of faith did not begin with Abraham, nor with Moses, nor even with the patriarchs of the Bible. Before any religion was structured, before there was a sacred text, before the religious traditions we know were organized, there was something even deeper, purer, more ancestral. The spiritual connection of African peoples with the divine. Yes, the truth is shocking. There is an African God, or rather a spiritual conception of God, who was worshipped thousands of years before the emergence of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This God was not a pagan figure nor part of fanciful polytheistic mythologies. He was the creator, the supreme, the one above all. And this revelation can completely change the way you view your faith, your story, and even your identity. Have you ever wondered why African spirituality has been so erased over the centuries? Why does the history of such an ancient continent with such rich traditions rarely appear in theology books or traditional sermons? Today, you will delve into a spiritual journey that many avoid sharing. You will discover that Africa was not only the cradle of civilization, but also the cradle of universal spirituality. You'll understand that before religion, there was revelation. Before dogma, there was connection. And that before religious institutions, there was a people who knew the divine through experience, not through doctrine. But why was this truth hidden? Why didn't anyone tell you that the concept of a single God, creator of all things, already existed in Africa before the Bible was written? Why does modern theology avoid discussing that gods like Olodumare, Nzambi, Mpungu, Amma, and others were worshipped as supreme deities, and that there is nothing inferior about that? Get ready, because what you're about to discover could be groundbreaking and maybe even shake up your deepest certainties. This is not just another spiritual content. This is a calling, an invitation to rescue an ancient, spiritual, profound, and yes, shocking truth that the faith of our African ancestors was the first structured form of worship of a single God long before religions dominated the world. And here's a warning. If you are prepared to hear what has never been said in pulpits, history books, or religious schools, if you feel like something inside you is asking for deeper answers, if you suspect there is something wrong with what you have always been told about God, faith, and spirituality, so stay with me, because from now on, we will open a portal to a hidden, erased, and perhaps purposefully silenced spiritual history. And at the end, you will understand why this African God can be the key to restoring your original faith, your spiritual identity, and even your freedom of belief. But before revealing this divinity, his names, his attributes, and what the Bible silently confirms about him, you need to understand how it all started. Let's go back to the beginning, to the cradle of humanity, to the truth that precedes religion. To understand humanity's most ancient spiritual origins, we must momentarily set aside the lenses given to us by Western culture, traditional Christianity, and the European model of faith. We must silence the noise of organized religions and listen to what comes from deep within the earth, from the red dust of a continent that bears not only humanity's history, but also its first connection with the divine. African spirituality did not begin with colonization, nor with the influence of other civilizations. It existed when stones still spoke, when trees were considered sacred, when rivers were respected as portals between the visible and the invisible. Long before the Torah, the Quran, or the New Testament were even considered, African peoples maintained a direct relationship with a higher power. They called it by different names, but the essence was the same. A supreme creator, unique, eternal, and inaccessible to the common man. This power, this divine presence, was not represented by an image, could not be touched or fully described. It was felt, revered, and honored. And this form of worship did not depend on temples built by human hands, nor on obligatory rituals written in sacred books. Ancestral spirituality was alive, present in daily life, in harvests, in dances, in the cycles of the moon, in births and deaths. And this is precisely where we need to pay attention. Africa was not only the cradle of human life, according to modern science, it was and is the cradle of universal spirituality. To ignore this is to erase centuries of history, wisdom, and profound revelations that existed long before the term religion was coined. Did you know that several scholars already recognized that the ancient Egyptians, for example, had such a complex and profound spiritual worldview that many concepts later found in the Bible, Judaism, and Christianity seem to echo these earlier beliefs? But this truth isn't only found in Egypt. In sub-Saharan Africa, among the Bantu, Yoruba, Akan, and many other peoples, the concept of a creator god was already established and deeply rooted. This god was responsible for all that exists, but he was not to be confused with the elements of nature. He created them. This creator was worshipped with respect and awe, but also with spiritual closeness, as people believed they could communicate with him through their ancestors, dreams, and spiritual signs occurring in nature. This was not idolatry. It was a direct connection with the invisible. It was spirituality in its purest form, before religious dogmas and impositions distorted the original vision of divinity. For a long time, these traditions were ignored, ridiculed, or labeled as paganism, witchcraft, or primitive beliefs. But why? Why is there so much resistance to accepting that the first conception of God may have originated in Africa, not the Middle East? Why is it so difficult to admit that African spirituality carries principles that today form the basis of many modern religions, but which have never received due recognition? The answer lies in the intentional erasure of history. When colonizers arrived in Africa, they saw a people deeply connected to the spiritual. And this frightened them because they realized that these people were not savages as they preached, but rather wise, intuitive, full of spiritual codes that defied the control of European religions. So what did they do? They erased, they silenced, they replaced. They rewrote history and placed the European as the bearer of true faith. But this narrative begins to crumble when we look at the evidence. Archaeology, oral history, ancient records, and even the Bible. Yes, the Bible itself provides clues that African spirituality not only existed, but was revered and recognized. Ethiopia, for example, is mentioned numerous times in Scripture as a land of wisdom, power, and spirituality. Moses lived in Egypt. Jesus spent part of his childhood in Egypt. The eunuch of Queen Candace, mentioned in the book of Acts, was from Africa. The African presence in the biblical narrative is much greater than you've been told, but it has always been treated as peripheral when in fact it is at the center. If the Bible begins in Genesis, spirituality begins before Genesis. It begins with men and women who looked to the heavens, felt the divine presence, and knew there was something beyond what the eyes could see. It begins with songs around the fire, with stories passed down from generation to generation, with symbols carved in stone, and with dances that represented the harmony between the visible and the invisible. When we say that the truth was hidden, we mean exactly that. The idea that Africa was the origin of faith and not just physical life is groundbreaking because it means that everything that was built afterward arose from an already existing foundation. That organized religion, with its temples, laws, and dogmas, merely systematized what Africans already lived organically. They didn't need books. They were the book. Their bodies, their stories, their spiritual practices carried the revelation. And perhaps that's why, to this day, many feel something is missing from modern religions, that there's a void that rituals can't fill, an inner echo that seems to call for something older, more true, and that something could be the ancestral spirituality alive and pulsating that still inhabits the hearts of those descended from Africa, even if they don't consciously know it. But understanding this truth requires courage. It demands questioning what we've been taught. It demands listening to our ancestors with an open heart. Because if what we've been told so far has already surprised you, what comes next will impact you even more deeply. The next part of our journey will reveal names, stories, and connections that few have dared to explore. And that's where the truth begins to unsettle. Because this isn't just about an African god. This is about a single God, creator of all, who was recognized and revered long before any religion took credit for it. Now that you understand that African spirituality predates all organized religions, it's time to delve even deeper into this ancient mystery. Because yes, there was a God, a single supreme God, creator of all. And he was known, recognized and worshipped long before Moses ascended Sinai, or Abraham heard the divine voice for the first time. But who was this God? How did the African people speak to him? And why has his name disappeared from official records as if he had never existed? The name varies according to ethnicity, region, and culture. But the meaning, the essence, remains the same. This God was not represented by images or idols. He was absolute, invisible, indescribable, eternal. He was the one who stands above everything and everyone. One of the best-known names, for example, is Olodumare. In the Yoruba system, Olodumare is the all, the uncreated, the one without beginning or end. He is not one of the gods. He is the God, the only one, the sovereign, the source from which everything emanates. He is not directly accessed by humans, not because of distance or coldness, but because his greatness is so great that it demands respect, reverence, and spiritual purity. Among the Bantu peoples, especially in the Congo and Angola regions, he is called Nzambi Mpungu. This name carries the weight of eternity. Nzambi is the one who creates, sustains, and governs. He is responsible for establishing order in the universe. He does not need to be seen or heard with human ears. His presence manifests itself through nature, through signs, through the winds, through the spiritual consciousness of those who pay attention. He is the heart of creation. He does not dwell in stone temples. He dwells in all that is life. Another deeply relevant and ancient name is Amma, worshipped among the Dogon people of Mali. Amma is the supreme creator who formed the universe from a cosmic egg, initiating all matter and life through divine processes. In ancient Egypt, we find Amun-Ra, considered the hidden god, the invisible principle of all things. He could not be represented in his entirety. He was the creator of himself, that which existed before existence. And it's curious to note how this concept, even coming from such an ancient civilization, aligns with the deepest principles of modern monotheism. In other words, when you hear that the concept of a single God emerged with Judaism, this is simply not true. The idea of an absolute creator already existed in the heart of the African continent millennia before. These names, Olodumare, Nzambi Mpungu, Amma, Amun-Ra, are not just cultural labels. They carry deep spiritual layers, stories that have been passed down from generation to generation in oral narratives, songs, rituals, and symbols. They represent not only the faith of a people, but a universal spiritual truth that has been erased, silenced, and distorted. And all of this for a very simple reason: power. When colonizers arrived in Africa, they realized that these people were not spiritually ignorant. They knew more about the nature of God than many trained theologians. They had access to the invisible. And what is more dangerous for those who seek control, a people who think for themselves or a people who believe only what they are told? The answer is obvious. Therefore, the name of these original gods, or rather this supreme and original God, was buried, ridiculed, and transformed into folklore. But even today, if you visit villages, traditional communities, and even some urban homes where ancestral heritage is alive, you'll find this cult preserved. You'll hear songs that invoke Olodumare as the source of all things. You'll witness prayers and offerings to Nzambi Mpungu with a purity that no rigid liturgy can imitate. You'll realize that faith, when born of the Spirit and not of fear, expresses itself with freedom, beauty, and truth. And most surprisingly, many of the values taught by these ancient spiritual systems are the same as those advocated by Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, only in a different guise. Love for one's neighbor, respect for nature, justice, humility, righteousness, compassion, spiritual responsibility. None of this is imported from modern religions. These virtues were already present in ancestral African systems long before they were canonized by any sacred text. Furthermore, have you ever stopped to consider the symbolism of Jesus' birth among an oppressed people amid a culture influenced by Egyptian and African traditions? That he fled to Egypt and was protected there during his childhood? That the 3 wise men came from the east, bearing gifts guided by spiritual signs, just as African priests read the signs of nature to this day? None of this is coincidence, but these connections have been hidden from you. So at this point, you need to understand we're not just talking about culture. We're talking about deep ancestral spirituality that belongs to you. Yes, it belongs to you. Even if you were born on another continent, even if your skin color is different, because ancestral African spirituality is not the property of a single people. It is the spiritual starting point of humanity. Deeper still, did the worship of a single God truly begin with the Hebrews? Or did this faith already exist in places that were purposefully erased from official history? And here begins the surprising revelation. The idea of a single God, creator of all things, just, invisible, and omnipotent, did not originate with Judaism. And this assertion can shake the foundations of what many people consider unquestionable. But if we are here seeking the truth, we must be honest with the evidence that screams from the forgotten corners of history. Ancient African cultures, thousands of years before Moses, already practiced what we might call essential spiritual monotheism. This means that despite the existence of intermediary entities such as ancestors, spiritual forces, and guides, there was recognition of one God above all. And more than that, this God was not merely the creator of matter. He was the maintainer of the spiritual order, the judge of good and evil, the Lord of time, death, and life. The similarity to what would later be called Wengbuech in the Hebrew tradition cannot be ignored. These people already spoke of heaven, of the afterlife, of the soul surviving the body. Many believed that after death the spirit was judged not only by external actions, but by the intentions of the heart. And see how this echoes exactly what Jesus taught centuries later. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man, but what comes out of the heart. Now, how could these ideas be present in civilizations that were supposedly primitive? How is it possible that a people without a Bible, without a church, without written doctrine understood such refined concepts of morality, eternal judgment, and redemption? The answer is profound and simple at the same time. Divine revelation didn't begin with writing. It began with consciousness. Before prophets existed, there was spiritual perception. Before texts, there was sacred intuition. Before paper, there was the awakened soul, and ancient African peoples were masters of this. They knew not by imposition, but by communion, that there was a just, observant, eternal, and present God. They knew that their actions here echoed in the afterlife. They knew that life was more than body. It was soul energy moving between dimensions. And when we look at the beliefs of civilizations like the ancient Egyptians, the Yoruba, the Bantu, the Dogon, and the Ashanti, we see a pattern. All recognize the existence of an absolute creator. In some cultures, he was so sacred that his name was never even spoken in vain. He was reserved, guarded, revered. Worship took place through sacred rituals, but the essence always pointed to this supreme God. Not one among many, but the one who stands above all. What's more, these people already had clear notions of right and wrong, purity and impurity, forgiveness, repentance, and purpose. The concept of spiritual justice was alive, not a dead letter on a tablet, but a principle vibrating in the collective consciousness. They didn't need priests to translate what their hearts already knew. And that's precisely why, when institutional religion took shape, there was a deliberate attempt to erase this memory. After all, how can we justify the idea that a primitive people knew more about God than so-called civilized nations? How can we accept that the African continent, so often associated with ignorance, was actually a storehouse of ancient spiritual revelations? It's easier to call it witchcraft, superstition. It's more convenient to remain silent than to revere. But the truth insists on resurfacing. And here, you might be asking yourself, so did modern religions simply copy these ancient beliefs? And I'll answer you with all caution. It's not about copying, it's about continuity. Revelation is progressive. What was whispered in ancient Africa was later organized into doctrines, but this doesn't invalidate the origin. Quite the opposite. It shows that the seed of faith was planted in African soil. And isn't it curious to think that Moses, the one who supposedly inaugurated God's great revelation, was raised in Egypt among the African spiritual mysteries? Could it really be that he never absorbed the teachings there? Could it really be that he never heard of a supreme God in the Egyptian courts, in the chants of the priests, in the pyramids built with cosmic alignments? Could it really be that the God he encountered in the desert was an absolute novelty, or the echo of something he had known since childhood? These questions are not meant to attack beliefs, but to expand perceptions. Faith need not be limited to be true, and truth need not exclude what came before. If God is eternal, so is his revelation, and if he has always existed, then he has always spoken, even if not through scripture, but through wind, water, fire, the silence of the night. And who heard first? It was those with the ear of the awakened spirit. It was the ancestors. Therefore, when we look at what African peoples already knew about creation, judgment, heaven, and the soul, we are not faced with coincidences. We are faced with spiritual parallels that point to a single truth. Spirituality is not the monopoly of any religion. Spirituality is the breath of God in the human soul. And the first to hear this breath were the peoples who lived in communion with the earth, the heavens, and their own conscience. The Bible, may contain traces, fragments, and direct echoes of African spiritual traditions. And no, this isn't a theory to diminish the importance of Scripture. Quite the opposite. This is a revelation that honors the most ancient roots of faith. The first thing we need to understand is that the Bible did not emerge in a vacuum. It was born in a geographical, cultural, and spiritual context profoundly influenced by African civilizations. We cannot ignore the fact that much of the biblical narrative takes place in territories directly bordering Africa, and often within it. Egypt, for example, was not just a biblical setting. It was the center of the ancient world, an empire of wisdom, mystery, spiritual knowledge, and connection with the unseen. Let's look at the book of Genesis. The famous phrase, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," refers us to a concept of origin and creation that was already present in African cosmogonic myths long before this text was written. The Yoruba spoke of Olodumare, the Creator who formed the world from primordial mud and breathed life into the first being. The Bantu already taught that Nzambi Mpungu molded man with his own hands and gave him life energy. And the Egyptians had the tradition of Atum or Ptah, who created the world with the Word. Yes, the Word, exactly as the Gospel of John describes in the beginning, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. These similarities cannot be ignored. They are profound spiritual parallels, and the more we investigate, the more connections emerge. Let's talk about the flood. The narrative of the universal flood is present in many cultures. But among the peoples of West Africa, for example, there are stories passed down orally for centuries that speak of great floods sent by the Creator to purify the earth. The similarity to Noah's story is striking. In one of these versions, a family is spared for preserving sacred values and for their spiritual connection with their ancestors. The concept of judgment, renewal, and promise appears exactly as in Genesis. This points to something much greater than copying or influence. It shows that there is a spiritual thread of truth that spans centuries and continents, and if we return to the biblical characters, we see that the connection with Africa is constant. Moses was raised in Egypt. He lived there for decades. He was educated in Pharaoh's house, where spirituality was as present as the air he breathed. Did he never absorb anything? Could it be that the man who liberated the Hebrew people from Egypt didn't carry African spiritual traits in his formation, shaping his vision of the world, of God, and of justice? Joseph, son of Jacob, also spent most of his life in Egypt. He became one of that nation's greatest authorities. He married an Egyptian woman. His sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were born in Egypt. This means that 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel have Egyptian blood, and this isn't theory, it's in the Bible. Now consider, how could God's people carry African roots in their identity? And yet this connection be ignored by interpreters of the faith, and there's more. When Jesus was born, the place chosen to protect his life was Egypt. Not Greece, not Rome, not Jerusalem, but Egypt, the heart of spiritual Africa. And the most surprising thing is that the Gospels don't detail much about his experience there. How long did he stay? What did he learn? Who did he live with? Why was this period silenced? Perhaps because Egypt, and by extension African knowledge, has always been treated as something to be feared, avoided, and demonized. Black spirituality was for centuries associated with superstition, witchcraft, and deviance. But why? Because it was dangerous, or because it was too powerful? Perhaps the latter, because a people who connect directly with the Creator without intermediaries, without golden temples, without human hierarchies, are a free people. And spiritual freedom has always been a threat to those who seek control. In fact, there are biblical texts that carry narrative structures identical to African mythologies. The idea that God speaks through dreams, for example, is central to African traditions. Dream interpretation was practiced by priests and elders as a tool for divine revelation. This appears prominently in Joseph, Daniel, and even in passages from the New Testament. The concept of a soul transcending death is also present. The Egyptians spoke of the Ka and the Ba, aspects of the soul that lived beyond the body and underwent spiritual judgments. The Bible, in turn, speaks to us of the spirit returning to God, of resurrection, and of the final judgment. Once again, this is not a matter of copying, but of spiritual continuity revealed in different languages. Even the tabernacle, with its divisions, symbolism, and use of gold, precious stones, and natural elements, bears similarities to the ceremonial temples of some ancient African cultures. The presence of the sacred, the attention to detail, the separation between the common and the holy, all of this was already practiced before in other forms with the same principles. What this shows us is that the Bible didn't emerge from nowhere. It's a point within a much larger spiritual web, one that began long before the first letter was written. And if we allow ourselves to recognize this, we can access a much deeper, broader, and more liberating faith. A faith that doesn't need to deny its roots to be legitimate. A faith that embraces the truth, even if that truth has been hidden for centuries. We have reached a point in our journey where intuition begins to meet confirmation. What your spirit has already begun to perceive now begins to find support in the evidence that time has not been able to completely erase. Because although they have tried to silence African spirituality, erase its depth, and ridicule its practices, the evidence remains standing like monuments that defy oblivion. And this evidence is not only found in written texts. Much of it is engraved in stone, in chants in the bones of the earth, in myths that have spanned millennia and reached us through the mouths of the ancients. Let's start with archaeology. In the sands of Egypt, the Sahara, Nubia, and various regions of sub-Saharan Africa, archaeologists have found traces of religious practices far older than any known biblical account. And we're not just talking about idols or magical rituals, as many would like to reduce them to. We're talking about shrines dedicated to a supreme god, symbols of celestial worship, records of lunar calendars used to determine sacred dates, and structures aligned with the stars, signs of a worldview that connected the divine to the universe in a precise and impressive way. There are temples over 5,000 years old, built with sophisticated spiritual engineering, where every stone seems to know its exact place, as if positioned not only with technical expertise, but with reverence. There are tombs that are not just tombs, but portals between dimensions. There are symbolic writings that speak of the soul, judgment, reincarnation, the afterlife, repentance and spiritual purity, all before any biblical prophet appeared on the scene of history. This evidence is often ignored because it doesn't fit the dominant narrative. But ignoring is not the same as erasing. Now think with me, why do the Egyptian pyramids remain a mystery to this day? Why, with all our modern technology, can't we fully understand how they were built? Because they weren't built purely technically. They were built with a spiritual purpose. They were monuments of faith, divine codes in architectural form. And even with all the efforts to reduce them to tourist curiosities, they remain there, challenging anyone who dares to see beyond the obvious. But it's not only in Egypt that we find evidence. African oral tradition is one of humanity's greatest treasures. Unlike what the Western world values, which are written documents recorded on paper, African peoples entrusted the preservation of truth to the living word. And this word was passed down from generation to generation faithfully and zealously, as if it were a verbal temple where spirituality was sheltered. And the most incredible thing, many of these stories speak of the creation of the world, the origin of humankind, the existence of a supreme creator, the judgment of the dead, the journey of the soul, the battle between good and evil, the importance of righteousness, themes that later appear in the Bible, the Gospels and Paul's letters. How could this be possible if Africans had no religion and lived in ignorance? The answer is simple, because the spirituality they carried was original. It was a source. It was a root. Furthermore, if we look closely at the history of other later civilizations, we will see that the religious foundations of many peoples draw directly from African wisdom. The Greeks, for example, so revered for their philosophy and mythology, learned from the Egyptians. Pythagoras, Plato, Socrates, all studied in Egypt before developing their ideas. And what does this show us? That African spirituality not only predated these cultures, but also profoundly influenced them. The very idea of an immortal soul, so central to Christianity, was incorporated from African teachings. The concept that the soul continues its journey, that it is judged, that it can evolve or regress, that there is a spiritual plane beyond the physical, all of this was systematized long before the religious councils of the Christian era. But it is not given due credit because recognizing Africa as a spiritual source would mean tearing down the pillars of Western religious pride, and this for many is unacceptable. Did you know, for example, that the Hebrews who left Egypt with Moses brought with them much more than just gold? They carried with them customs, practices, notions of purity, temple architecture, and even expressions that originated in Egyptian spirituality. This doesn't diminish the Bible. Quite the contrary, it makes it even richer because it shows that it is part of a continuous spiritual flow, a river that began to flow long before it was named Jordan. But this river needs to be rediscovered. And to do so, we must have the humility to look upon what has been called savagery with eyes of reverence. We need to hear the drums not as noise, but as the spiritual heartbeat of a people who have never forgotten where they came from. We need to look at the symbols, the rituals, the proverbs, the African tales, and realize that they carry the same essence that many seek in temples today, a connection with the sacred. And if you've come this far with me, perhaps you're beginning to realize that ancestral African spirituality isn't just a historical study. It's a calling, a reminder that faith didn't begin when you were told. It began long before. It began with those who heard God in nature, in silence, in dance, in dreams. It began with those who didn't need proof because they lived the truth. If everything we've revealed so far about the ancestral God, about ancient spiritual practices, about the similarities between African myths and biblical accounts, about the material and oral evidence pointing to an African spiritual origin is so evident, so rich and so powerful, then the inevitable question that arises is, why isn't anyone talking about this? Why has this truth been hidden? Why does it never appear in history books, in theological seminaries, in Sunday sermons? The answer, though uncomfortable, is clear. Because there was and still is a systematic and deliberate effort to erase Africa's spiritual heritage. And this effort didn't begin yesterday. It's long-standing, meticulously constructed, fueled by religious, political, and ideological interests. To understand how this happened, we must go back in time to the first movements of European colonial expansion. When Europeans began colonizing the African continent, they did not encounter savage, barbaric, or ignorant peoples. As their narratives insist to this day, they encountered spiritually sophisticated civilizations with codes of conduct, structured social systems, ancestral wisdom, and most importantly, living faith. It was not a written, dogmatic, or theologized faith. It was a breathed faith embodied in everyday life, present in the rhythm of the drum, in the dance, in listening to the spirit. This faith was too free for European standards. It didn't fit within the confines of the institutional church. It didn't submit to the clerical hierarchy. And more than that, this faith gave the people an inner power that could not be controlled. A people who know they are connected to the Creator do not easily bow down to an oppressor. A people who carry the sacred within them do not accept being inferiorized. Therefore, to dominate Africa, it was necessary to sever their spiritual connection with their origins. And that is exactly what they did. Colonization wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The colonizers knew that the greatest control one can have over a people is the control of their identity, and spirituality is the core of any culture's identity. Therefore, erasing African gods, delegitimizing rituals, demonizing symbols, and replacing everything with a European version of faith was part of the plan. And this plan was so well executed that for centuries, African descendants themselves began to reject their spiritual origins as if they were sinful. But the project didn't stop there. With the rise of organized religions, particularly European Christianity, an even more powerful weapon entered the scene: theology as a tool of erasure. Theology, which should be an instrument of light and revelation, was used as a wall to keep out anything that sounded pagan, primitive, or heretical. And so African concepts of divinity, purity, communion, and judgment were labeled as the work of the enemy. The demonization of African spirituality was one of the greatest injustices ever committed in the religious history of humanity. Imagine a people who for millennia honored a single invisible creator and just God being accused of idolatry by those who had just discovered monotheism. Imagine practices of connection with nature and ancestors which predated the Old Testament being called witchcraft by those who never even grasped their depth. And here comes Eurocentrism. Everything not born in Europe was treated as inferior, exotic, or worse, as evil. This view shaped not only theology, but also education, culture, science, and politics. The image of God was whitewashed. The history of faith was rewritten. Biblical characters were painted with European features, and the African was cast as a latecomer to salvation, as if his role in divine history was merely that of someone to be rescued and civilized. But this is a distortion. The truth is that the African was not at the end of the spiritual line. He was at the beginning. He did not receive the light from Europe. He carried the original light, the one that came not from cathedrals, but from the heart connected to the Creator. But this truth needed to be silenced because a spiritually conscious Africa would not accept chains, neither physical nor mental. And so it was that ancestral traditions were pushed to the margins while the dominant religion became an instrument of control. The Bible was translated, edited, and interpreted through a European lens, and what was African was excluded. Even passages that reveal the presence of Africa and Africans in Scripture were downplayed, ignored, or reinterpreted to avoid arousing suspicion. But the question is, why so much fear of African spirituality? Because it has something no organized religion can replicate. It doesn't depend on a system, a temple, or a leadership. It depends solely on a direct connection to the source, and this freedom is revolutionary. Today, when you look at books, documentaries, and traditional theology courses, almost none of them talk about Africa's role as a spiritual source. They don't talk about it because it's inappropriate, because acknowledging this would be admitting that the roots of faith are in the South, not the North. They are in black people, not in white people. They are in the ancestral, not in the modern. But now you're seeing it with your own eyes, you're hearing it with your own ears, and perhaps you're feeling it with your own soul. The truth has been hidden, but it's alive, breathing within you, moving within your spirit, calling you to remember. After so many centuries of erasure, silence, and distortion, something powerful is happening. A silent but growing movement is taking shape in various corners of the world, especially among those descended from Africa. It's as if, after generations of living under the weight of disconnection, the collective spirit of Africans and their descendants is beginning to awaken. This isn't just a historical curiosity, nor a cultural trend. It's deeper than that. What's happening is a spiritual rescue, and this rescue isn't coming from the media, universities, or traditional altars. It's coming from within the people. It's as if something dormant is coming back to life. As if, without knowing exactly how or why, thousands of people are beginning to ask themselves, where did my faith come from? Who were my ancestors? Why was I told it all began on another continent with another people of another color? And these questions are breaking chains that have been imposed by centuries of religious and cultural repression. The return to roots movement isn't a fad. It's the spiritual response of a generation tired of repeating lifeless dogmas. People tired of seeing themselves excluded from altars, pulpits, and sacred images. People tired of singing praises that don't speak their inner language, that don't represent their journey, that don't honor their ancestry. And so these people began searching, and the more they searched, the more they realized that the spirituality running through their veins isn't heresy, it's heritage. Today, a renaissance is taking place. Men and women, young and old, are reconnecting with the wisdom of their ancestors. They are studying the original belief systems not with a judgmental eye, but with a heart of reconciliation. They are understanding that being Christian and honoring their ancestors is not a sin. It is healing, it is reconciliation, it is the restoration of spiritual identity, because an African Christian who ignores his or her roots is without realizing it serving a half-hearted faith. What's happening is that the African people and their descendants are once again hearing the voice that was silenced. They are reclaiming the symbols that were desecrated. They are relearning to dance with their spirit, to praise with their bodies, to pray with their feet on the ground. They are looking to the heavens and understanding the connection with God doesn't require a passport, a European accent or theological approval. The connection is direct, clean and alive. And this has transformed churches. It has transformed communities. It has transformed lives. Pastors and spiritual leaders who once taught a faith based on fear are now allowing themselves to teach a faith based on belonging. In many places, the Bible is being reread with new eyes that don't dismiss the text but recognize the context, eyes that know that the Egypt of the Bible is not just a symbolic enemy, but also the cradle of wisdom that sheltered Christ himself. Many are discovering that the Christian faith, when disconnected from African history, loses color, loses scent, loses ground, and they are understanding that there is no true salvation without reconciliation with one's origins. Because it is impossible to serve a God you imagine with a face that has never resembled yours, and believe that this does not harm your spirituality. Spiritual recovery also involves healing the image they have created of God. An image that excludes, whitens and colonizes. But now that image is being restored. Young black people are courageously embracing their spirituality. They're saying loud and clear, I don't need to abandon my faith to honor my ancestors. And I don't need to abandon my ancestors to follow the faith that connects me to the Creator. And this is breaking centuries of religious manipulation. It's liberating families. It's healing the trauma of generations who were taught to be ashamed of their own spirituality. It's important to emphasize that this redemption is not an invitation to substitution. It's not about abandoning one faith to adopt another. It's about completing what was severed, restoring what was broken, making room for a full integral faith where the cross and the drums can coexist, where the altar and the ancestral tree can embrace, where the Holy Spirit isn't frightened by chants in African languages. This movement is happening everywhere in rural and urban communities, in churches and conversation circles, in universities and religious centers, on social media and family gatherings. Because when a spiritual truth is awakened, no temple can contain it. It overflows. It touches those who have ears. And this is the time for overflow. And perhaps without realizing it, you're already participating in this rescue. Perhaps you've felt restless lately, a discomfort with the explanations you've always been given, a weariness of repeating speeches that don't resonate with your soul. Perhaps you've begun to hear ancient voices within you calling you to remember, to return, to reconnect. This is no coincidence, it's an answer. It's your spirit saying, I recognize myself in this truth. And when that happens, there's no more pretending you didn't hear. From this point on, the journey changes because now you walk with awareness. Now you know you're not a passive recipient of others' faith. You are the heir to an original faith, a faith that pulses in your blood, in your name, in your history. After everything we've been through so far, from the forgotten origin of faith through cultural tests, historical distortion, and the ongoing spiritual rescue, it is impossible to continue on this journey without asking a question that echoes deep within the soul. Who is God for you? Not the answer you learned in catechism, not the one you were taught at Sunday service or in the book you read as a teenager. I'm talking about the essence. That silent voice that speaks to you when no one is around. The presence that visits you when all other references fail. This God who searches you. Who knows you beyond religion, beyond doctrine, beyond what you repeat? Do you really know him? Or have you merely inherited an idea about him? This is one of life's most important reflections because we often live within a borrowed spirituality, a faith born not from our own experience, but from the imposition of a model. And there's a big difference between having faith and repeating a tradition. True faith is alive, it moves, it touches, it transforms, it questions, it confronts, it liberates, and above all, it connects you to the essence of the divine without walls, without filters, without intermediaries. So think honestly now, was your faith inherited or discovered? Do you believe what you believe because you felt it? Because you experienced it? Because you encountered God in your own deserts? Or because you were convinced, trained, or conditioned? Are you truly connected to the sacred presence that inhabits all things? Or are you simply obeying an institutional model that tells you where God begins and ends? It's hard to ask this kind of question, but necessary because an unexamined faith becomes a prison. And God was never a jailer. He is freedom. He is presence. He is root and flight. He doesn't fit within the contours that men have drawn. He isn't limited by the books they have published. He isn't confined by the dogmas they have created. God is spirit, and where the spirit is, there is freedom. But is your spirituality truly free? How many times have you found yourself repeating verses you don't understand? Singing songs that don't resonate with your heart, frequenting spaces where you can't be your whole self. How many times have you silenced your own questions so as not to appear weak in faith? How many times have you sensed something was wrong but ignored it, afraid of sinning? These questions aren't meant to shame you, they're meant to awaken you. Because God isn't afraid of your doubts. God isn't bothered by your questions. On the contrary, He provokes them. He calls you to look deeper, to go beyond the surface, because true spirituality isn't about obeying rules. It's about knowing the heart of the Creator. And perhaps you're beginning to realize that this knowledge doesn't come just from books. It comes from inner listening, from silence, from contemplation, from the ancestral memory that pulses within you. Perhaps you're realizing that what they called voices from the past were in fact echoes of God Himself, calling you back to Himself. Have you ever stopped to think why you were told certain things were evil? Why were you taught to distrust your own intuition? Why have so many spiritual cultures been called profane? Because if you could hear God's voice unfiltered again, if you could walk with Him untethered again, you would become so free. And spiritual freedom is everything the system fears. Because a free soul cannot be manipulated. It does not surrender to fear. It does not sell itself for approval. A free soul knows who it is. It knows where it came from. And it knows where it is going. And this freedom begins with an honest question. Is the God I serve the same one who lives within me? Or is it a concept imposed by others? Have you ever wept silently, feeling that there's something deeper in faith than you've been shown? Have you ever felt a connection between you and God that doesn't depend on rituals or pretty words? Have you ever felt like there's a God who knows you before religion, before history, before your own conscience? This God is not far away. He is within you. But perhaps you have been taught to always look for him outside, in the temple, at the altar, in the pastor, in the priest, in the book, in the missionary. And this is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the most sacred place where God can dwell is within you. Your soul is the altar. Your spirit is the temple, and that changes everything. When you understand that God is intimate, accessible, real, that he speaks to you directly without the need for translators, you stop chasing and start walking with him. Faith stops being an effort and becomes an encounter. Spirituality stops being an obligation and becomes a breath. But for that to happen, you have to unlearn. Unlearn fear. Unlearn the format. Unlearn the caricatures you were given of God, and that can hurt. It can generate conflict. It can distance you from people who still live on the surface. But it will also bring you closer to something much more precious, your spiritual truth. And this truth will show you that God never needed to be explained. He needs to be felt. That religion can lead you to the door, but you are the one who opens it. That sacred texts are maps, but the journey is yours. And that every profound experience with the sacred begins with an act of courage, asking, allowing yourself to feel, walking through unknown territories, trusting that God is there too. Now answer me honestly, who is God to you? Not the God you were taught, the God you feel, the God who sustains you on days when no one understands what you're going through. This God, what is he like? How do you see him? How does he communicate with you? If you've made it this far, it's because this message resonated with something inside you, and that's no small feat, because when the Spirit moves, it leads you to where the truth lies. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it shakes everything you thought you knew, deep delved, roots sought, shadows confronted, light walked awareness, the quest is just beginning.